transcended the politics of his own time. And the importance of this point can't be overstated, because for too long, the idea of the commons has been misrepresented as somehow synonymous with big government and the welfare state. So that now, any talk about cooperation or the common good inspires the wildest accusations and caricatures and hysteria.
What we're getting is a big government ideology.
I've arrived at the Dalles in northern Oregon. I've long wanted to see the Columbia River, and it's been 1,000 miles to get here. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do, except that my long-range aim is to drive from here west all the way to the coast at Astoria, which was the final point where Lewis and Clark established some kind of headquarters after making the trek to explore Western America, and then drive down the coast back home. In the meantime, I'm going to explore Dalles for a few minutes. I'm standing against a mural, which I will now show you. There's quite a few murals around here. This is on one side of the street, the opposite to where I opened this particular segment. And this one assumes is the Columbia River. There are murals all over the place, and this is the main street of the Dalles. This in the window of a jewelry store. Help them to live. Help us empty this window. This old bank building is only 1920 it dates to, but replaced an original one of the first buildings in town in 1879, and that catered to the miners who found a lot of gold and deposited it in the bank, and also there were sheep herders and people like that in those days who used the bank. There are quite a lot of old buildings here, dating back at least a century. That one there looks pretty old, but I'm not going any nearer. I'm definitely partial to places that like murals. And this is a modern one, talking about the county that we're in, Wasco County. The Oregon Trail came through here, all those pioneers heading west. That would have been a century and a half ago, I guess. And of course Mount Hood you'll be hearing a lot more about. The license plates say Oregon Trail on them. Well, I didn't stay in town very long because I had the misfortune to run into Trooper Mark Jubitz, the local police. Actually, I think he's a state trooper. But the distance between where I gassed up, the gas station, and the tourist office is 2 blocks, literally just around the corner. And he stopped me and gave me a $110 ticket for not wearing a seat belt in that 2 blocks. So my advice is, if you come to the Dalles, get out of town fast before you meet Mark Jubitz. This is the first actual sight I've had of the Columbia River. I'm on the highway, not quite adjoining it, because I'm on the way to some Columbia Gap Museum. The road below is 84, which runs along the river most of the way to the west. This is Columbia Gorge Discovery Center, so it's worth a moment or two of tape. Nice piece of carving. And over here is a canoe once used by the Indians. Pretty long. There's a nicer example. Amongst the tiles on the floor is what I assume is the course of the Columbia River. A shiny tile that runs the length of the museum. Wow, I wonder if that lived here once. This is what I assume is like an early trapper's hut. Kind of small.
See those little animals start out in life and it just gives you kind of a thrill. Of course, the same thing can happen, I guess, in the reverse of it.
These are some of the plants growing in the gorge. Kind of pretty. This looks like marijuana, but obviously isn't. And this is nearby. It's a very lovely tall waterfall. These pioneers are on a raft which they use to go down the river, ever seeking more free places in the west. People were driving along the highway pretty early, along the Columbia River Highway, driving in cars like this. And once the pioneers got settled, the land was very fruitful. Peaches, pears, apples. The Indians were still here. And then eventually they built this huge Bonneville Dam, which we'll probably see further on our route. The railway, as well as the road, runs beside the river. You can't see because of the trucks. This is US 84. There's the stop train down there, and here's where the river adjoining the highway really opens up. Oh, there's the train. The one I took earlier back. A long train. Anyway, the river really opens up wide here. See through the fence here is the huge Bonneville Dam on the Columbia River. Well, all these people are gazing at something, so maybe there are fish there. Oh, there they are. They're kind of dark in dark water, but they're kind of huge. And lots of them. All those dark streaks are different fish. And here is a little machine. You put in a quarter and you get some fish food. I have to try that. And there are lots of little birds waiting nearby. I guess for people who drop the fish food. Here are lots of tiny little fish. You can't really see them very well. But what we were looking at before, there are big trout. Actually rainbow trout. And the funny thing is that when you drop the seed, birds fly and fall over. I just threw all my seed to the birds instead of putting them in for the fish. Whole swarms of birds sit nearby and wait for somebody to use the 25-cent machine. Nice fountain here, just by the visitor center. With fish on it. Oh, I'm certainly glad I turned off the road long enough to see this. It's not far from the highway. It's called the Multnomah Falls, and it drops quite a way. It's just a little parking center. The highway is so near you can see the cars going by there. Just my curiosity, it said Multnomah Falls, so I thought I'd better see what it was. I'm fairly near Portland, and I'm actually looking for a cheap motel. I thought I would have found one by now, but most of them are in the $70 plus range, whereas I've only been paying $50 to $60 so far on my journey. I expect to be away 9 or 10 nights, so there is a difference if I pay $20 extra every night. We're in Astoria, which is as far west as you can go in the United States, or at least in Oregon. It's the northernmost point, the end of the Columbia River, and a fascinating place. And last year, 2011, it celebrated its 200th anniversary. So what it's well known for, among other things, are a lot of Victorian houses, some of which I'll try to find. Looking up this street, there's some certainly old booking places. I don't know how old. Here are a few on this street here. Can't say for sure they're Victorian, but they certainly look it. One thing Oregon will never run out of is wood, because there's trees everywhere, mostly fir, I think. Some of them have been turned into bed and breakfasts. Rather charming. Here's a beauty. Let's go take a closer look at this one. Here's a famous one. It's called Flavel House. And you can actually get tickets and tour it. Yeah, sort of terrific. The Flavel House. I'll find the date of that in my research later. Very tall tree next to it, and a very substantial, obviously public building across the street. Anyway, I'm now going to keep my appointment with Patrick Webb, who is managing editor of the daily paper here, the Astorian. So if I can, I'll persuade him to come on camera for a few moments. Now we have Patrick here, who's editor of the local paper, and we were talking about the riverboat pilots, who sort of the equivalent of the fireman heroes of most towns. Here it's the riverboat pilots. Couldn't you say something about those kind of people?
Well, sure. The Columbia River meets the Pacific Ocean, where the border of Oregon and Washington is, and it's a dangerous crossing over what's called the Bar, the Columbia River Bar. And we have the bar pilots group, who are all former mariners. They're all folks that have had their mariner's license and have been master of a ship for many years. So they're all very mature people, let's say, and they basically risk their life on a daily basis, going out in either little ships or by helicopter and being winched down onto the big cargo ships, and helping pilot them into through stormy weather often to the Columbia River. They then hand them off to river pilots who take them the rest of the way up the river to Portland, Kalama, and points east.
I think you said also, you quoted that line about it being the graveyard of the Pacific, because it really is so dangerous.
That is the nickname, and I suspect that there's other areas in the world that are called that, but there's multiple shipwrecks. Sometimes the maps that they have at various museums and elsewhere are absolutely littered with crosses where the ships have gone down. The most famous one in the Warrenton area was the Peter Iredale that went down in the early 1900s, and it was a metal sailing bark from England. And it was, you can still see the wreck on the beach when the sand uncovers it.
What is it about the river meeting the sea here that's so dangerous? Because, I mean, you know, rivers run into the sea everywhere pretty much. But, I mean, this is particularly dangerous. Even before I came here, I knew that.
Well, I think, I don't know the technicalities, but I think the issue is that we have bad weather here consistently. I mean, it does occasionally stop raining in northwest Oregon, but we have a sunny day, but we have consistently bad weather, and it is a narrow, turbulent channel that the boats have to navigate through, and sometimes if there's a storm or bad weather, they're a lot better off to put out anchor in the ocean and just ride it out.
And I think you said that the highest paid local workers, even though as often as not they don't even actually live here, they just come in to do the job.
The bar pilots, yes,
Yeah.
they are suitably rewarded for the dangerous work that they do. Many of them have strong connections in the community. They're involved in different organizations. I know one of them is an artist and is involved in a multitude of things. So some of them are very prominent, very visible, and others, they have other homes elsewhere, and they come in and do their shifts and their periods where they're on duty, and then they go out of the area for rest and recuperation.
Oh, that's great. Now, most of the people who come here would know all about the history of Lewis and Clark and the Oregon Trail and stuff like that. Do you think that's what attracts a lot of them?
Well, I think Astoria has so many options as far as what attracts people. Astoria Warrenton is where Lewis and Clark arrived in 1805 and were rescued by the Chinook Indians and the Clatsops, who assisted them during that time when the weather was really bad in November 1805. And of course we have museums and other elements and a recreation of their fort called Fort Clatsop, where they wintered overwintered and went back. So that would be a key element of Astoria's attraction. But the other thing is the houses. We have a lot of Victorian style houses dating back to more than a century, and we have a very, very active preservation society that works very hard to encourage owners and to assist owners in keeping them up. And while they're not exactly open to the public inside as museums, they are really nice to tour the outsides and see the old Victorian houses that in many towns don't exist.
Right. Oh, great. Well, thank you very much. That's very informative. Okay. So this is one of the boats that he talked about that the river pilots use. It's now beached and by the main road into town. It's right across from the river, and of course the headquarters of the Pilots Association is further down, and behind it is a place you can actually swim, which maybe I'll do tomorrow. But anyway, what we'll do next is we'll go to the Maritime Museum, which comes highly recommended. I'm not really into museums that much, but this is supposed to be a particularly good one. There's the trolley, which I'm planning to take a bit later on. The Columbia River Maritime Museum.
The sea with an untamed and mysterious beauty. Is Columbia, the great river of the West. By volume, the second largest river in North America. Its tributaries drain nearly 260,000 square miles. Scores of rivers merge to become this mighty one. North from the Kootenai in Canada, east from the Snake in Wyoming, south from the Oahe in Nevada, and west the Willamette to the Pacific Ocean. Early explorers eventually dwindled. Today, the canneries have all but disappeared. A tug can haul as many as 5 barges, towing thousands of tons.
Well, I feel that the towboats and the tows are the main mode of transportation, just on the account of the economy of it. It would take several freight trains, and it would take hundreds of trucks.
Up the river highway, past barges laden with iron, steel, petroleum products, and fertilizers. Down the river come wheat, corn, lumber, even frozen French fries, and other products headed for an ocean journey.
The lots are set up for 85 feet wide, 150 feet long. And you have to be inside those dimensions to fit.
Vancouver, Washington. They transport Northwest products, paper and logs, corn, wheat, and soybeans, around the world to places like Egypt, Japan, and Pakistan.
Columbia River pilot. Let's go off. Oh, Captain. Doug Burrows, River pilot. Good morning. I will be taking the ship to Astoria today.
Who cautiously navigate the river's deceptively narrow and winding ship channel.
Port 20. Ship this size, we are loaded down to 36.5 feet of draft in a 40-foot channel, so there's very little room for the bottom of the ship to the bottom of the channel. Port 10.
To be on a foreign ship is to take advantage of all the local knowledge that he has gained throughout the years. The foreign ships will come into the river here, and he might come from Hong Kong, or he might come from Venezuela, and he might not have ever been here before.
Nothing upriver is as treacherous as the fearsome waters at its mouth, the Columbia River Bar, where the force of 1,200 miles of powerful river collides with the might of the Pacific Ocean. Mountainous swells, thunderous breaking waves, violent seas made even wilder by winter storms. Over the years, thousands of vessels have been lost on the bar. It's been dubbed Graveyard of the Pacific. A bar pilot boards to take the place of the river pilot. There are fewer than 24 of these elite bar pilots, some of the best in the world.
Captain Roger Nelson, bar pilot. Captain.
The distinguishing factor for the Columbia River Bar is the long fetch of the ocean swell. This incoming swell is met by the tremendous river discharge, and the two meet head-on the bar. The hardest thing to predict about working on the bar is the weather, and particularly the fronts, the winter fronts when they're coming in. We routinely work at over 60 knots of wind down on the ladder to the level of the boat deck, because the sudden rise of the boat would crush you between the side of the ship and the boat. That is the most dangerous part of our job, is the embarking or disembarking from the ships.
The until it's so big, and there's so much. The Columbia Bar can be busy and dangerous, especially to small boats. At times is no less dangerous than William Clark's description in 1805. The immense seas and waves roar, and this roaring has continued 24 days. Its waters are foaming and perpetually break with immense waves, tempestuous and horrible.
Since 1792, approximately 2,000 vessels, including 200 large ships, have sunk at the Columbia River Bar, and more than 700 people have lost their lives to the sea. The graveyard of the Pacific. 40-foot waves and fog for most of the year, crossing the bar. The fishermen often misjudge how rough it is. The Coast Guard rescue 400 people a year. That's more than one a day. This is interesting. It gives 3 case histories of decisions that coxswains had to make about crossing the bar to maybe save people, and how it came out. You lift the thing up to find the answer. Really is a good museum.
You'll find a curious mixture
A lighthouse
of
beam.
and fanciful speculation. You may recognize some familiar names and landforms, and you may be surprised by how much land was simply invented. But keep in mind that these maps were the tools of empire. They are smaller.
This section is all about fishing, canning and whaling. And these are labels from hundreds of different brands of canned salmon. They came from China in search of work in the canneries. Cannery conditions were cold, wet and miserable. The Chinese labourers worked at butchering and cutting fish, dangerous, bloody, repetitive jobs that nobody else wanted. Tough job working those ships. Meeting 40-foot waves, even today's largest cargo ships can be tossed around like bath oils. Imagine what it's like with a small boat with these waves. You could and still can take a river cruise on a steamboat, which at one time was quite luxurious. And also somewhat crowded. Here's a demonstration of knots. The different kind of knots that every seaman knows. Here's kind of a floor map of the river. I started at the Dalles, went to Hood River, and all the way out to Astoria. Salmon canning capital of the world. In the area in 1880, almost a third of the inhabitants were Chinese workers. At one time, just keeping the salmon in ice was about the only way to preserve it. And then at the beginning of the 19th century, the French army under Napoleon developed a way of canning it safely. Slices of salmon had to be put into the cans in a certain way so they would fit perfectly. The skin would always be on the outside next to the can sides, never in the middle. You had to know how to put the salmon in the cans. Yes, it is a nice museum, and of course it looks out onto the river. Well, the tourist department told me that they get more requests to see this place than anything else.
We get a lot of people. Where are you from?
I'm from Southern California.
Yeah. And
originally
someplace else, I can tell.
Originally from England.
There you go.
A long time ago, I'm afraid.
Okay, I'm going on.
So you get visitors every day, one assumes.
Lots in the summertime.
Did you get a lot of money when people make a film about, you know, your house?
We don't get any. We get nothing.
I have to admit I never even heard of the movie, but the tourist department told me that it was very much visited, so anyway, there we go. It's a very long, circuitous route to get to the column, the tower, the Astoria column it's called. This is the first view of it. The funny thing is, you can't even see it from down below, and yet it's very tall. The view from when you get to the top of the hill is, as you might guess, quite magnificent. There's the Columbia River. There's the town down below. And this is where the river meets the sea, so that's where the famous bar would be, where the really rough seas are, where the where the Columbia opens into the sea. And there's the Columbia River going now east when I look that way. Big parking lot here, you have to pay $1 to park. And Lewis and Clark expedition is shown on the column itself, which I'll get near to in a minute. Here are Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. I don't know which is which. They got here in 1805. That's Meriwether and that's Clark. The weather was terrible. Since we arrived in sight of the Great Western, for I cannot say Pacific, Ocean, as I have not seen one Pacific day since we arrived, my arrival. Here the column is marked on the map, showing where it is in relation to, in fact, where I'm standing right now. As you can see that it opens out to the sea to the left there. Here are some statistics. Cost $27,000 to build. Cost $1 million to restore it. $300 ships pass Astoria monthly. The bar is 600 yards wide, 5 miles long and 55 feet deep. How many steps are there? I've forgotten. Somebody.
164.
So it takes what, an hour to climb, I guess?
4 minutes.
It takes a long time. Depends on how tough you are.
That's right.
You can't see terribly clearly from down below, but it does actually depict an ascending spiral of views of the journey of Lewis and Clark across the country until it reached here. You can actually see these pictures about the Lewis and Clark journey more clearly from this side. I should have thought about that. There's more light on this side, but they go all the way up the column. Anyway, built in 1926, the column, even older than me. Right up to the top. Some people climb the 100-odd steps. I'm sitting here waiting for the little trolley that runs along the waterfront. It only costs $1 round trip, goes a mile or so. The whole thing takes about 45-50 minutes. I don't expect I'll see very much. It does run alongside or near the river, but unless there's something on the river, I don't really think there'll be a great deal to videotape, but anyway, we'll see. And here comes the trolley. I've been waiting about half an hour roughly. It doesn't run when it rains. I guess it's because it's kind of old and a bit rickety. A t-shirt.
That was the Union Cooperative Cannery.
The first
how it
bridge.
had started was the first immigrants in this area were Finnish.
First
and
bridge
they came
over
here
the
to work
river.
in the canneries or on the fishing boats. And when they got here, they were not happy. It was built in 1890, and it housed the single men that came here to work in the canneries. And
Just past the mouth
ironically,
of the
it's still
river.
a boarding house, and it's this taverns. It's actually shaped like a triangle. And they would send them. Notice there's a lot of.
That was the first bridge across the river that we passed, just past the mouth of the river. She talks all the time, except when we stop, so it's hard to make any comment. There are stops every few hundred yards.
He anchored out there, and the bar pilot usually boards by helicopter about 5 miles out to sea, and he'll climb a.
Where the river
it's very
pilots
dangerous, the Columbia
hang out.
River bar, of course. Pretty soon there was wires running all over Astoria. It got pretty big, so we had to move up to the top of the hill there with the Astoria.
Here's the Great Maritime Museum, which I've already been at. Very attractive museum.
Thank you. It's a beautiful place. If you have time, you need to go up there. Especially water tactical exercises where they get like a can of pilings there. That was an old net drying shed. It was built in 1880s, and back then the fishing boats, they had to use linen nets. They didn't have the man-made materials, so the nets had to dry. Little trap doors, and they would take the nets right up and let them dry for a couple of days, and then they'd be on their way. Years later, that's almost 100 years later, it was purchased by an artist who worked up, flipped it over, and now it's a little bridge. The only that was pretty clever. The story behind these sea lions is we're not sure why, but this, for some reason,
This is a boat based at the eastern end of town.
Okay, so if you look real.
At this point, everybody turns around the seats to face the other way. And the driver makes his way to the other end, and we start back.
Again, our losers' cages there on the side, and this is where they
There's several hundred old Victorian
This is Safeway.
houses in Astoria.
The reason for that is the ones on the top are older. The ones on the lower are new. And that whole area was destroyed by a mudslide, which wiped out the original trees back in the 1950s. Also destroyed about 30 houses. And they cleared the area slide zone so they can no longer build in that area. There is one exception. If you look up, you'll see a white house with a red roof. That is our mayor's house, Mayor Van Dusen. He's a very popular mayor. His family's been in political leadership for about 5 generations. And one thing I noticed,
all those houses overlook and are fairly near the river. Some apartments were advertised about $250,000.
the families from Portland, the mothers and the kids in summer would come stay in Seaside if it was too hot in Portland.
Trains stopped running in the
window here.
Well, Fort Clatsop is where Lewis and Clark made their little camp at the end of their long journey across country. Anyway, in a clearing here in the woods, it's extremely quiet because it's early in the day, is where Lewis and Clark built their camp Today there are benches and tables and you can come here and have a picnic. But it's very tranquil and very tree shaded. And a trail leads down to the river, which I think is a little tributary of the Columbia at this point. It's so early in the day, unusual for me, the visitor center hasn't even opened yet. But there's a ranger there with a big dog. And a little dog. It's when they're on the ground that you realize how big these trees are. The place is named after the Clatsop Indians, and it's here where our intrepid explorers spent 4 months in almost constant rain. And they built a fort. This fort is a reproduction of the original built on William Clark's plans, which they found. Obviously there was plenty of wood. You can glimpse the river down there, not far from the fort. There were 33 in the party altogether, not just Lewis and Clark. And as I say, they spent 4 months here and it rained a lot. The rooms aren't all that bad. A bed and a chair, shelf. Must have been a bit boring though. This one had bunks in it. Seems fairly safe to assume this was the toilet. Here are the names of the entire party. They were friendly with the local Clatsop Indians, so I suppose the fort was guarded against bears and things. Meriwether Lewis was chosen by Jefferson as his private secretary and instructed to take this trip, and Jefferson brought along his friend William Clark. There's Jefferson. Both these two were military officers with frontier experience. The exploration took 2 years. The men wore buckskin shoes and garments. I doubt if these are the original. Carried tools and guns. The Indians told him a dead whale had been beached, so they went to sea, bought some of the blubber and the oil. I've had eel whale meat, it tastes like steak.